You've probably heard the news about our energy situation.
The demand for power.
Rise in the demand for electricity.
Driving demand and straining the grid.
Surging energy demand.
Demand on power plants is increasing.
Apparently, we need power. We need it now, thanks to widespread electrification, growing cities, and AI data centers. It's starting to sound like we're one question to a chatbot away from rolling blackouts. But are we? Welcome to Lab Coat Optional from Arizona State University, the show where advanced research meets everyday curiosity. I'm your host, Pete Zrioka, and today we're looking past the headlines and trying to answer a deceptively simple question. Can our current energy systems keep up with the rate of demand? To answer this question, I'm joined by two veterans of the energy industry. Gary Dirks has spent 50 years in the energy world, from leading BP Asia Pacific to directing solar energy initiatives at ASU. Kelly Barr has spent more than 3 decades working at SRP, or the Salt River Project, where she helped to plan the power grid that keeps one of the hottest metro areas in the United States habitable. Together, the pair lead a program called Energy Forward at ASU's Global Futures Laboratory. We talk AI data centers, policy whiplash, nuclear's revival, and why, despite what you might hear in the headlines, neither of them thinks we're headed for an energy apocalypse anytime soon. Gary, Kelly, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to talk to you guys about energy today.
It's a great topic.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The big question, energy demand. Can we put some numbers on that? Like, what kind of demand are we looking at nationally, regionally? And yeah, please, whoever can take that one, that would be great.
I'll be happy to jump in and get it started. And I'll start actually globally. Because,
okay, oh, even better.
And well, I think it's important from time to time to jump out to the globe because big chunks of the energy system are in fact global, particularly the hydrocarbon system. And there in 2025, growth in demand was around 2.5%, 2.5%. Electricity demand was quite a bit higher than that. It was more in the 3.5-ish range. If you come back to the United States, total demand growth was more like 1.2-ish%.
Okay. That doesn't seem like a lot.
No, it doesn't. But the thing that is really important that we get across in this discussion is how big the energy system is.
Okay.
So a couple of percent is hundreds of billions of dollars of new investment, hundreds of billions of dollars of new investment. So it doesn't take a lot of growth and you're talking big numbers. Now, I would also say globally, less so the United States in the last couple of decades, but globally, demand growth tends to track GDP growth.
Okay.
And pretty much percent by percent. So if you get a percent growth in GDP, you get a percent growth in energy demand. Okay.
So you put Kelly, go ahead.
And I would say in the United States, although those numbers are absolutely accurate, about 2.5%, there are pockets of very high growth.
Are we in
Arizona
one of those pockets?
is one of those, right?
So what percent are we looking at here?
In the metropolitan areas, we're looking at growth of about 5.5%. 5.7%. So year over year, that's a lot of new growth that's happening in the state.
So Gary was kind enough to put a dollar amount on it, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars investment per percent. When we talk about actual units of energy, what are we talking about? Because I don't know how much $100 billion means practically for how much energy that is. So what about, I think megawatts is thrown around. So
yeah, let's talk, maybe this helps a little bit.
Yes, please.
I know sometimes in energy, people have difficulty understanding the metrics. So I like to try to explain that if you think about a Target or a Walmart superstore, that's about 1 megawatt. So envision that for me for a second there.
Big building.
During the summertime, each one of the state utilities reaches a summer peak. So that's the most energy they serve all year long, right? And I believe, and don't hold me to these numbers, but it's about 8,500 megawatts for both APS and SRP, maybe 8,700 megawatts. So that's the most energy they serve over the summer at one particular time during the summer. So what the local utilities are telling us is that certainly in the days when I worked at SRP, we would be adding 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts a year. Okay. So think about a large solar plant or, a unit at a natural gas facility. What they're now being asked to do is add 615 megawatts a year. So the growth is just staggering,
astronomical.
It's very difficult to do. It's a lot. It's many new power plants or many new energy resources, along with the attendant transmission every year, and it's on a forced march. So we're going to be doing this for a long time.
Well, attendant transmission, meaning actually moving the energy from one place to another.
Right. So you just can't obviously plop a power plant in the middle of the desert. You're going to have to find a way to transport the electrons. So you have to build both the new transmission, but also the new generation resource, whether it's solar or wind or natural gas.
I'm starting to see why it's so expensive.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the next question is, all right, we're seeing 1% to 5% growth depending on global or regional. What's driving it? Are we talking, is it just population? People keep moving here? They need AC? What is it?
All of the above.
Oh, okay.
All of the above. And we've spent a lot of time looking at what's driving it. And so there's a couple things. One, there's kind of just baseline economic development growth. And Arizona saw a lot of that in the last several years. So new EV manufacturers, battery manufacturers, TSMC, a lot of growth, just general growth. But on top of that, what we're seeing now is data center growth. Mm-hmm. And if you think about large employers or large manufacturers, they also then bring with them new jobs. And people need new homes, and then they want a shopping center. And so there's a lot of subsequent growth that comes by virtue of that initial anchor growth.
I was curious, is this unique in history? Like, have we seen a precedent for this amount of energy demand growth before? I don't know. I imagine when electricity became a novelty, you started building out a system, but in modernity, is this unusual?
It is. It's very unusual to be growing at the rates that we're talking about. As you indicated, there are pockets. After World War II, there was a lot of energy growth, but of course, that in comparing them, that's on a percentage terms. In terms of absolute bring new energy to market, there's nothing like this.
And is it driven by all the factors Kelly was talking about, or is it?
Can
you attribute it to one?
It is. I would only add one other thing to what Kelly said, and that goes back to the global perspective again. The hydrocarbon system is being rewired largely on national security and broader security interests of countries. So the invasion of the Ukraine was a very big event. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the first thing that happened is Europeans stopped importing gas.
Yeah.
And there has been slowly over time more effective embargoing of Russian oil. So that led to a lot of new investment in different places, particularly in LNG to rewire that system.
Liquid natural gas.
Liquefied natural gas, yes, absolutely. And particularly in the United States has invested very heavily in liquefied natural gas, but not just the U.S.
And is that the gas we get from fracking?
Some of it comes from fracking. It doesn't have to come from fracking.
Okay.
Any natural gas can be liquefied. Mm-hmm. But in the United States, a lot of it does come from hydraulic fracturing, yes.
Okay. So drafting off of that question, are we looking at, in your opinion, this is for both of you, are we looking at kind of a temporary spike before we're going to even out our growth, our demand growth again? Or is this like a structural shift in how much energy we're going to be building out for the foreseeable future?
I think it's the new normal. I think we're going to be in a sustained growth pattern for quite some time, especially if you look at the data centers and AI.
Well, I agree, subject to data centers do continue growth. Mm-hmm. And as you know, there's some controversy out there about whether we're in an AI bubble, for example.
Yeah.
But I would tend to agree with Kelly that I think we should, at a minimum, be planning for explosive growth of data centers and be ready to make those investments if they're needed.
Planning. I would like to talk about planning. Mm-hmm.
functionally, and Kelly, this is for you because you come from the utility sector. Functionally, how do utilities plan for future demand? And has that become more complicated in the recent past?
Sure, yeah, it absolutely has. So utilities previously would take a look at their forecast, and they have very sophisticated forecasting tools. And they would say, all right, well, we anticipate that we'll get this much more economic development growth, and then the attendant residential and commercial that will come with that. And they would come up with a number, and they look at a very long range time frame. So they're looking at 10 years out, because the utility planning process is a long planning process.
You can't build a solar plant overnight.
Right. And you can't build the transmission that you need for that. Everything is a much longer process.
Right.
And I just want to punctuate. I need to make one comment that punctuates this entire conversation, and that
Please.
is reliability is king. We all love our air conditioning in the summertime. We want to be able to flip a switch and turn the electricity on. Utilities understand that, and they take that responsibility very seriously.
Yeah.
And so they're always looking carefully and conservatively to ensure that that power is there when you need it. So they have a very robust forecasting process. And then what we used to do, and I'll just speak for SRP, other utilities are coming around to this new process, but what we used to do is we would have the resource planners, and they'd say, okay, well, we need this many more power plants, these resources added to the system. And then they would take that and kind of throw that over the edge to the next department, which would be transmission. And the transmission group would say, okay, well, we'll look at these transmission routes to get it to load. Then they would throw that to the distribution planners, and the distribution planners would say, okay, this is what we'll do to get it to the homes and businesses that it needs to get to. And then we would talk to the customer programs folks and ask them if they had any customer programs they'd like to add.
That's very complicated.
It is very complicated, and it's very process oriented.
Yeah,
and at any stage of the game, what SRP learned is it makes sense to put all of those people in the same room at the beginning. There's an idea.
Yeah.
Including the customer programs folks, because the customer programs folks might be able to come up with some energy efficiency or some demand response programs that mean you don't have to build the resource in the first place.
I was curious about maybe the best way to put it is kind of maintenance. And I'm kicking this to either of you. If demand keeps going up, can our current grid and the things we're tacking onto it, can it handle that? Or are we looking at, 20th century infrastructure with 21st century demand? Like, we're talking about transmission before, that's going to be a new line with, I assume, the most updated technology. But I know, in California, they have PG&E has really old transmission lines out in the middle of nowhere, and they may or may not be causing forest fires sometimes. So how do we manage that with such an increase in demand?
I'd actually turn that question around and start with something that Kelly said about risk.
Okay.
The energy system doesn't take risk because really bad things happen if you get it wrong.
Uh-huh.
So by default, the grid will work because the utilities aren't going to bring a lot of new demand on if they think it's going to risk the stability of the grid. So really the question is not so much whether the grid can handle it, is how much do we have to evolve the grid so it can do more? And what kind of investments do we need to make in order to do that? And that gets back to an earlier question where we were talking about data centers. And again, Kelly talked about the risk of not having power, and we just won't do it. There is another kind of risk associated with, do they actually show up or not?
Oh.
So another thing that the energy system, and this is absolutely true for the electricity guys, the oil and gas guys is a little bit different, but not a lot. They won't overbuild because they can't afford to overbuild and not be able to use the assets. So they will try to meet their adequacy requirements so that they know they've got a reserve margin, but they're not going to overbuild. So they got to get this planning pretty much exactly right.
So if someone's promising a electric vehicle revolution that may or may not come, we're not going to see charging stations all over the place until those cars actually need them.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that about the charging stations, because that's a different group of people.
Okay.
But the utility will measure their investments to meet what they expect the demand to be. And they are not going to materially overbuild, and they're certainly not going to underbuild and then have problems with adequacy.
Okay.
Yeah. And that is an issue with data centers. So in my experience at the utility, often what would happen is folks would come in and they would say, we need 500 megawatts and we need it by Tuesday. And we would say, let's talk about that. Can we phase that in? Can we, and so we would come up with a plan. But what often happened, or occasionally happened, we would say, okay, well, we're going to get this resource for you. It's going to be a 500 megawatt resource. And by the time we would get down the path of doing the contract negotiations, those kinds of things, they'd say, well, what we really need is 300 megawatts. And so part of the issue that the utilities are having now is sorting out what's real, what's really going to show up, and when is it going to show up. So that's what they can plan for, and what's not really real.
Right.
And that's an issue.
So Gary, you've, as you said, 50 years in energy. Some of that's been leading international companies.
Mm-hmm.
And earlier we talked about global demand. I was kind of curious as your perspective on where the United States is positioned for, this energy growth and transition versus other places.
Yes. So I don't typically talk about a transition.
Okay.
And the reason for that is a transition implies that we're here, and at some point in time we're going to be over here. And maybe not. It isn't quite as cut and dry as that. So I will typically talk about a transformation, or the energy system evolves, and it has always evolved. And as you think about where the United States is headed, I think we have some real strengths, and I think there's some things we need to be concerned about. The strengths that we have is we do have very good energy companies, whether it's oil and gas or whether it's the utilities. We have a lot of very good energy companies, and they have done a good job of supplying the nation with energy reliably and affordably. So we have a good base to work from.
Okay.
That's the good news. We have a lot of assets, raw energy assets. So we've got oil and gas, we've got coal, we've got wind, we've got solar, we've got hydro. We've got a lot of good assets to build on.
Right.
Now, where it gets more complicated is we don't have the supply chains as robust as I would ideally like to see them. So we don't build solar panels. We don't build wind turbines. And without going through every energy form, the reality is that we import a lot of hardware. So we are very much dependent on a global supply chain in order to meet those needs. So on balance, I think we're in a good place as long as we don't get complacent.
Okay.
And we keep a mindful eye on these supply chains. We know how much equipment we're going to need and where we're going to need to get it from. And ideally, we do some reshoring of these things. Then I think we can be okay. Now, the only other thing I would say is it isn't helpful to have the kind of policy whipsaw that we have in this country. Most big nations are somewhat more stable from a policy perspective than we are. Unfortunately, I think that's a feature in the United States. So you just have to kind of work around it. But some continuity between administrations would be a really good idea.
How do you work around that, though? Because, I mean, look, if we have one administration saying we have a 25-year solar plan and we're going to build that out, and then 4 to 8 years later, the script flips, like, are a bunch of energy companies left holding the bag?
Well, they can be. As you know, wind has taken a bit of a beating in the United States with the most recent change in administration. But the reality is, and Kelly mentioned this in some of her remarks earlier, these are long time horizons, and typically they go well beyond any single administration. So the energy companies have a tendency to keep their head down and their eye on the ball and just keep moving it along so that they can meet the energy needs of their customers. They do a pretty good job, and they certainly work quite hard at staying out of the line of sight on the more partisan stuff.
Yeah.
And just get it done. And I think that's what's happening in the U.S. too. The solar investment is still progressing quite nicely, actually.
Kelly, can you talk a little bit about that perspective of energy companies keeping their heads down and eye on the ball? Can you chart kind of a course of energy investment over the last 10 or 15 years, regardless of where the political winds were blowing?
Well, I totally agree with what Gary just said, and you have to kind of keep your eye on the ball in your planning. But I will say that, if you think about during my tenure at SRP, I was there certainly when there was a big focus on transforming our energy portfolio. Okay. And a lot of tax incentives were generated for solar and renewables. And utilities took advantage of those, right? And developers took advantage of those. And it was much easier and more cost-effective for consumers to take advantage of those renewables. And with the change in policy, all of those are gone now. And so that does have implications on the resource portfolio. It makes certain resources less cost-effective than they had been in the past. But Gary's overall point about the supply chain is a really important one. Again, this mismatch in timing, people who are trying to locate here and build a business here and need power don't want to be told, well, we can get to you in about 10 years. And so utilities really have to have a really sophisticated forecast model, have to be very well connected with the economic developers to understand what might be coming and plan a little bit for on the assumption that some of that is going to show up, right? Because you have to be ahead of it. You always have to be ahead of the wave.
I mean, it sounds like a nightmare job, honestly, to try and plan that and be like, okay, and also we have to factor in whether or not our priority or the federal priorities are going to shift entirely and we're going to change our entire game plan.
Yeah.
That's
it is a hard job. And that, I think that's one, there are a lot of unsung heroes in this industry, and the resource planners and the utility planners are among those folks. I mean, they work really, really hard to keep your lights on and keep you safe and keep you comfortable. And I think we take a lot of that for granted.
I certainly have until just this moment. So we just talked about a wide range of different energy resources. Looking at the demand we have right now and the demand we're facing in the coming years, if you were both to kind of build your ideal future-proofed energy portfolio, can you tell us, me and listeners, what that would look like?
I'll take a stab at it, and I'm sure Gary will add to it.
Please.
Obviously, utilities need to look at the short term. And what Gary mentioned, that solar is still very much a part of the portfolio. And one of the reasons that solar is very much still a part of the portfolio, even without the incentives, is that it can be built much more quickly than a natural gas turbine and natural gas plant. Because, as Gary said, a lot of the components are either manufactured offshore or there are very long queues to get a natural gas turbine. So 7 years, 8 years. Okay. So solar and renewables you can probably bring online a lot quicker. So in my ideal portfolio, I would bring on as much solar and wind and renewables, carbon-free resources as we could. But you have to have a natural gas backbone. And people, somehow some folks don't like natural gas. They prefer not to have it in the portfolio. But I'm telling you, as part of this reliability backbone, you have to have natural gas in your portfolio. And then in the longer term, I would really focus on nuclear. I think nuclear is a great option. It's an expensive option, but it has the benefit of being both base load, so it can operate 24/7, and carbon-free. And that's what I would put in my portfolio.
I wouldn't change any of that. I would just then summarize by saying you want a diverse portfolio, but depending on exactly where you are in the world and in a nation, take advantage of the resources you have and keep as much of it at home as you can. So in the case of Arizona, that means we've got good sun. We should take full advantage of we've got good sun. We import most of the rest of the energy that we consume. So we should be mindful that we're importing the rest of the energy we're consuming.
Yeah. You mentioned nuclear.
I did.
I would like to talk more about nuclear. It's back in the conversation in a very serious way. And it seems to be largely driven by data centers. Again, we're coming back to data centers again. What has to change either in terms of political will or public opinion or policy to make nuclear a viable option again? Or for the first time, maybe? I don't even know. You tell me.
I think it was a viable option in the past. Certainly, I'm not sure that very many people understand this, but for the longest time, we had the country's largest nuclear power plant in our backyard in Palo Verde, right? But we've had a really great nuclear resource that's operated safely and effectively and provided lots and lots of megawatts for many, many years in our backyard. What seems to be talked about a lot right now is small modular reactors, SMRs. And those, I think, have a great deal of promise. The problem is the regulatory construct, they always they need to get approved. Not only the design has to be approved, but then the construction has to be approved, the siting has to be approved, and that is just a slow process. My sense is, and I don't, I'm not a nuclear expert, but my sense is we want it to be slow for some reason, right? We want it to be careful. We want
if we're going to take our time with anything, it should be nuclear stuff.
We want to be, but there is only one SMR design that's been approved. And then there's obviously the more traditional, larger nuclear facilities like Palo Verde. Those designs have been approved and could be constructed, but they're very expensive.
Right.
So the biggest nut to crack from my perspective is the financing of these. My sense, a single utility cannot put a Palo Verde on its balance sheet by itself. If you're going to do traditional nuclear in the future, you're going to have a number of utilities who all get together and decide to build it. And it would be great if our federal government would get involved in the financing.
Can you mentioned, I think you said 7 to 9 years for a natural gas turbine. What are we looking at for a traditional nuclear power plant? How long does that one of those take to? If we're talking from the ground up,
from a supply chain perspective,
just how long does it take to get one of those guys online? I imagine it's got to be longer, right?
Yeah, I think for a power plant like that, a traditional power plant, a nuclear power plant, I don't think you can expect to see those online before 2040.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Now the SMRs, if they could move quickly through the approval process, and you might get one or two of those. But utilities don't really want to purchase the first serial number of any new technology, right? You want somebody else to Gary's point about risk, you want somebody else to take the risk.
Yeah.
And so I believe that there's one, I believe it's a Hitachi that the Tennessee Valley Authority is moving forward with.
Okay.
But that's going to be serial number one, and we're going to have to get more experience with the technology, I think, before you see a lot more people jump into it.
Do you think utilities are going to be forced to take on an amount of risk with the energy demand we're looking at? Like you mentioned the Tennessee Valley Authority, they're going to be buying this Hitachi small modular reactor. Mm-hmm. Are we going to see more of that where people take a risk on a new technology to meet the demand that they're facing?
That's a really good question, and a lot of that is going to depend on what we end up believing at the federal level about this digital arms race we're in with the Chinese.
Okay.
Because if we come to a broad consensus that it is a major national security issue, then there will be one set of priorities and actions coming out of those priorities. And if we believe it's manageable over a longer period of time and it doesn't represent a huge security risk, then we're in a different set. I think, and Kelly has made this point already, that it just isn't in the social contract for utilities to be taking risk on technology that isn't well proven. Mm-hmm. That's not what they're there to do. And I would emphasize that TVA is a government entity too, by the way. It's not a typical utility. So they are in a better position to be able to take some of this kind of risk. So I think the game plan from the standpoint of the U.S. needs to be, how do we get up the learning curve on these things or down the learning curve on these things so that they can become attractive for utilities to invest in. Now, if it's just the normal course of business, I think it will be 2040. If the feds feel like they have to intervene, then it could come faster. But even if the feds do feel like they have to intervene, I'd go back to what Kelly said earlier. We have other resources.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't as though we don't have wind and solar and natural gas that we could develop. I don't think we have to take extraordinary risks on nuclear, even in a high security environment.
So we've been talking a lot about investment.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, I wonder, who's going to foot the bill for this? Because, we've also talked about the federal government intervening and providing or taking away incentives to invest in different types of energy. So will higher demand is ultimately going to mean higher energy prices for people?
It doesn't necessarily need to mean higher energy prices, no.
That's good.
Well, and the reason I say that is I'll go back to what I said a while ago about demand for energy tends to track GDP. Now, in the United States, it's not quite so linear because the United States, for quite a long period of time in the early 2000s, was growing more or less with flat energy demand. And a lot of that was driven by energy efficiency and measures we were taking to reduce energy consumption. But we're probably headed back into an era where it looks more like that. Well, if the economy is growing and you're adding energy to meet that demand, that doesn't mean the prices have to go up because you've got a larger economy that's consuming all of that.
Okay.
What I would say is that ultimately all costs go to the consumer, don't they? Because in some form they get passed through.
Right.
Yeah, we've just completed a process where we invited a lot of data centers and cities and utilities and NGOs and others to come and talk about this energy demand. And I think there's a lot of concern about data center growth or load growth negatively impacting existing customers. Mm-hmm. And prices are going up. APS and TEP are both. APS currently has a rate case. I think TEP is about to file one. SRP just raised its rates last year. So they're going up, but they're not going up because data centers have joined the mix. They're going up just like every other cost that we are experiencing, due to inflation, due to the removal of the incentives, due to the maintenance of the current system.
Okay.
So there are no parties to blame here for the increase. It's just, cost of living, cost of inflation. That's what's happening in the energy system.
Okay. Well, one question I had was, what happens if we don't meet this demand? But
not an option.
That is the picture you've painted for me because, as you said at the outset, stability is king, right?
Right.
Reliability is king. Reliability is king. So
right.
We're not going to look at rolling blackouts because they build 10 new data centers around here because we're going to accommodate that.
But let me just follow up on that because I do think this mismatch in the timing with the utility planning scale being a little bit longer than what the data centers or large load companies need at this time, I actually think that's helpful. And the reason I think that's helpful is because, Gary mentioned there's some concern about whether this is a bubble or how much of this is really real. Well, the fact that it's going to take, 10 years to construct a brand new transmission line or 10 years to build new resources, gives us a little bit of time for that to play out a little bit.
Yeah.
And so it is a conservative mechanism that helps protect consumers from overbuilding.
Sure.
For things that don't show up. I think the things that really are here and they are going to be built here and they're going to be good for the community, they will get built and the utilities will accommodate them. But it won't be tomorrow. We're going to be careful about how we do it so that, one, the system is protected,
right?
That reliability remains paramount, that the system is protected and we're not overbuilding and therefore having stranded assets that other customers have to pay for. So I think the utility, sometimes I think utilities get criticized unfairly about being too conservative.
Right.
But in this case, I think we want them to be conservative.
Yeah. No, I understand that perspective. You're both at the Global Futures Laboratory. I was curious about the role you both see the universities and ASU in specific play in something like this. Like we're talking about something so practical and so like capital intensive as energy infrastructure. Like where do we come in to help this process? And
there are multiple entry points. At one end of the spectrum, we have a very large group of people who are just simply innovating new technology. And it's really quite impressive, the work that they're doing for new technologies or new ways to optimize the way we use our energy system. A lot of work, for example, on AI as it relates to the energy system. And that's a big part of what we do. Now, all the way at the other end of the spectrum, and it's been threaded throughout this conversation, these are social problems that we're attempting to deal with. It's an all of a society concern. And Kelly alluded earlier to the data center event we had last week. Well, there we had data center companies, we had people from the power companies, we had people talking about economic development, we had people talking about the community interests in these things, and we had the cities. These are all groups of people with very legitimate interest in the way the energy system is meant to evolve going forward. That means there needs to be important conversations about energy as a system.
yeah.
And so at the other end of the spectrum, the university has a very large role to play in helping understand what do those constituencies look like, understanding what their interests are, getting them together to talk about what do we need to think about with respect to what the energy system should look like. I've mentioned several times the idea of a social contract, and I do because we used to talk about that all the time when I was with BP. What role do we play in society? What does society expect legitimately of us? I think the university is almost uniquely positioned to be able to explore and convene. And then that means alongside of that, we need to be doing research on the social pieces, not just the technical pieces, so that we can add insight to the conversation and ensure that they move along and that ideally you reach consensus, or at least you understand what it is exactly you're disagreeing about.
So Gary and I formed something called Energy Forward at ASU, and essentially it's the ecosystem of all of the folks at ASU who are engaged in exactly what Gary talked about. So you have engineers, you have social scientists, you have folks from the geography school or WP Carey, lots of folks working in the energy space. And Energy Forward is attempting to bring them all together under one umbrella because it is a complicated place. ASU can be a fairly complicated place, and we want to be that welcome mat. So you have an energy-related issue, contact us. We'll get you to the right people. And where you have a complex issue, we can bring together folks from different disciplines to focus on those various aspects that they can bring to the table.
When we're talking about the data center and the energy evolution landscape, I'm not using transition anymore. When we're talking about this whole subject, do either of you see an area where cities, communities, and utilities need help and they're not getting it right now? And that's specifically where Energy Forward is trying to address, trying to get to some really specific goals that you guys might have with the initiative.
Yeah, there's a couple things that following the data center event, which was last week, we sent out a survey, and certainly we organized it so that there would be long breaks and a long lunch so that people had time to actually speak to one another. There's a novel idea. And we heard a lot of really interesting conversations. So a couple of things really rose to the top. One is a playbook, a manual, something for cities who are being asked to consider data center development within their municipal boundaries, because every city is going to look at data centers slightly differently. But we're thinking about putting together kind of a list of considerations. You know, what kinds of questions should you be asking about water? What kinds of questions should you be asking about energy use? Where should they go? Should they be in an industrial park, or could they be in a neighborhood, or whatever? So just providing questions and resources for cities. But again, each city is going to decide for itself whether they want a data center or not. Another idea that we keep hearing about, given the fact that demand is growing so quickly and that the energy resources have a slower development timeline, is whether data centers could bring their own resources. And that sounds really great. Yeah, bring your own resources. Just show up and bring your solar solar plants with you. We want to dig into that. What exactly does that look like? How would they go about bringing, 500 megawatts of solar with them?
I mean, it hasn't worked out yet. Very famously, XAI or AIX, I don't remember, they landed in Nashville, right? And they brought a bunch of gas turbines with them, and people were not pleased about that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we need to sit down with folks and understand. I know that, having spoken with a number of these data centers, a lot of them have very significant carbon reduction goals, and they'd like to implement them.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd like some help with doing that. But it is a complicated thing.
Yeah.
And the utilities definitely need to be involved, because the last thing I personally want to see is a bunch of little islands of data centers with their own resources that are not interconnected to the grid. Mm-hmm. Because there's beauty in that interconnection. When one part is suffering, the other parts step up and help. And having little islands like that, I don't think is good for the long-term reliability of the system. And remember, reliability is king.
Take note, Texas.
Yes, right.
I'd like to add just one thing to that. A big part of what I think we do is to help people understand that there's no bad guys in this story. One of the challenges you always have when people are struggling against hard problems, if they start to get frustrated or if there are gaps in the story, there's a tendency to fill them in with bad guys.
Yeah, you look for someone to blame.
And there really aren't any in this story. There's a lot of people that are up against some pretty tough problems. So a big part of what I think the university does is kind of spot where those things are getting stuck, or where the narrative is kind of getting off a bit, and then inject ourselves in there and say, well, why don't we just sit down and talk about this and see if we can't get some kind of a sense of what's really going on here.
Are you optimistic about our energy future?
Yeah, absolutely. Remember I told you about those unsung heroes?
Yeah.
I am completely optimistic about their ability to ensure that we have sustainable, and all of the utilities, although this growth is creating issues for them and their ability to meet their sustainability goals, they remain committed to their long-term goals of net zero by 2050. And I think that's imperative for us to get to where we need to be. And so I remain very optimistic about their ability to pull that off.
What do you think, Gary?
Yeah, I am too. The only thing that would give me a little bit of pause is something that I mentioned earlier, having to do with national security and whether we begin to get deeply concerned at the national level about being in some kind of an arms race with the Chinese, and begin to push the system in ways that it's not really very well equipped to respond to. Now, I think the probability of that happening is actually quite small, because I think you'll see quite a significant backlash. People get really seriously upset, justifiably, when they don't have power for a week or so. And this is universally true across the world. So I don't anticipate that that's going to jump up and bite us, but I don't want to pretend that it couldn't.
Thank you both so much for joining me today. I come away with this with even more questions, but in a good way, because this is such a complicated, nuanced topic, and I had a feeling that was the case going in, but I know that is more clear than ever for me. So thank you for illuminating that. If people want to learn more about some of the stuff we talked about today, do either of you have some reading or listening or watching recommendations for the audience to dig into?
Depends on how wonky you want to get. There are some really great reports out there. They're long and they're very technical, but the International Energy Agency produces great materials. The Energy Information Administration in the United States produces great materials. RMI and a number of the national labs produce great things. There's actually quite a lot of quite good videos on YouTube.
Okay.
That you can watch. And the nice thing about those kinds of things is you can kind of take them a bite at a time and you can focus right in. If you want to know more about nuclear, just look up a video on nuclear. So I would say start with some videos that get you kind of into the spirit of it, and then move on to the big agency reports.
Great. Kelly?
I would recommend going to the EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute website. They have a public portal, and they have a lot of reports that are written in a way that a layperson can understand. So I'm encouraging people to do that if they're interested.
Great.
And then in terms of a book, I would recommend a book called California Burning.
California Burning. Sounds ominous.
Yeah, it talks, you at the very beginning, you talked a little bit about the California wildfires.
Yeah.
And it goes into what precipitated that. And I found it very interesting.
Great. Well, I will put those resources in the show notes for everyone. Thank you both again for joining me. And I hope you had fun. I did too. Or I did.
You did.
It was great.
You did.
Thank you.
Went by fast.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review in the podcast app of your choice. If you found us on YouTube, we'd really appreciate a like and a subscribe. Lab Coat Optional is a joint production of all the talented people at the Strategic Marketing and Communications team at Knowledge Enterprise at Arizona State University. Knowledge Enterprise is led by Executive Vice President Sally C. Morton. Until next time, stay curious.